There have been many terrifying instances over the years, but none was more scary than in the year 2006. And when many of you think of this year, I'm sure you can think of a good few terrifying incidents, such as the date June 6, 2006, lining up with the number of the beast in Christianity, or as most people know it, the spooky scary number. Or perhaps a terrifying memory that grasps you in 2006 was the fact that Adam Sandler's movie Click actually got nominated for a real-life actual Oscar. I'm not kidding. But of all of these scary incidents, only one reigns true to be the most terrifying in all that year: the release of a horrifying movie called Monster House. Oh, finally the spooky, scary time of the year is back. I feel like I've been waiting for it since October 31st came and went last year. And last year on this channel, we had a pretty fun Halloween. We had Adam Sandler's Hoobie Halloween to talk about. We talked about Opal: A Little Late by Jack Stauber. We got a look at Over the Garden Wall and regular shows Terror Tales of the Park. A lot of great fun stuff that, honestly, if you haven't seen, you should definitely check out to get yourself on the Halloween spirit. However, today you're probably here to hear about the actual subject of this video, Monster House. And to kick things off, I should give a little bit of a disclaimer. This movie was not a part of my childhood. In fact, it was the exact opposite. I saw this movie literally 4 or 5 hours ago, and I wrote up all my notes and I'm now talking about it. And full disclosure, I adore this movie. I really do. You saw the title and the thumbnail and whatnot, and that's probably what pulled you in the first place. But it needs to be said, I have no nostalgia for this film whatsoever. This is me going in as an adult and saying that this is one of the greatest Halloween movies that applies for all ages I've ever seen. You know, excluding some horror movies that are a little bit too much for the little kiddos that might go to see them. But Monster House is, honestly, as cliche as it sounds, it's fit for the whole family. So with that little disclaimer out of the way, I guess we're ready to talk about this movie and why I think it's so fantastic. But first, we need to break this bad boy down. Monster House follows DJ, Chowder, and Jenny as they try to uncover the mystery surrounding an old man's house named Mr. Nevercracker that is horrifyingly scary and just across the street. This old man will take things from kids that he leaves on the lawn, tells them to get lost, and after he has a heart attack and is hauled away in an ambulance, people start disappearing that go near the house. And as the title suggests, it is in fact a monster house. So our characters go on an adventure trying to destroy it, and they uncover the true secret of the house, that it is actually Mr. Nevercracker's wife possessing the house, and she hates children because they were horrible to her at a time, and she tries to eat them to both sustain herself and to get revenge, which is why Halloween is such a dangerous time, because they'll go up trick-or-treating and she will just eat them as the house. The gang destroys the house, it's a happy ending, and that's Monster House in the most plainest of forms. Now that's a pretty simple story as far as it goes, and I think that that's not a bad thing, especially for an animated kids movie rated PG. I think it's perfectly fine to be a little bit simple, but if it's going to be simple, it has to be really well thought out, and Monster House definitely is. Even most of its cliches, it finds a way to spin it a little bit. One thing I was concerned about with this movie was the cliche of an old man wanting kids off his lawn. They actually spun this for the sake of the story. The old man, Mr. Nevercracker, was trying to protect the kids from his wife that was the house. He knew that was her, and he knew that she would try to eat them. So he would tell them to get off his lawn unless they wanted to get eaten. And he was being 100% serious. He wasn't just trying to scare them. He was being honest. And that's kind of clever. That's kind of fun. And I really like that aspect of this movie. Everything feels kind of new and creative, but also familiar at the same time. And that comes with the setting of the movie as well. Not a lot of people will guess it right off the bat, but this is definitely a movie set in the 80s. However, it's not blatantly obvious like most of the 80s nostalgia stuff that we have today. It's pretty subtle with all of it. In fact, I didn't know the movie was set in the 80s until I did more research on it. I found out that it was set around 1983, 1984 in the hometown of one of the writers, Rob Schrab. So the setting and the time frame is all very, very genuine, and that helps push this movie along, but it also doesn't overdo it by throwing in a bunch of random 80s stuff as you're going along. Like, oh, do you remember this 80s song? Or do you remember how people used to do this or that or this in the 80s? There's none of that. It's all very much presented in a way that treats the audience like they're smart, where you could probably uncover that if you were really paying attention. Now, doing everything I just said is not easy. In fact, it's a classic case of easier said than done. I can say all that stuff, but when you really look at it, crafting a simple story that not only makes the audience feel smart, but is easy to follow and does not coincide with many tropes and cliches, that's incredibly difficult from a writing perspective. You have to be wildly creative and original and just smart in general to get that done. And that's all thanks to the three writers on this film: Dan Harmon, Rob Schrab, and Pamela Petler. All three of these writers each had an individual special talent to bring to the table when it came to writing this script. Of course, they're all incredibly talented writers, and I don't want to downplay anything else they've ever done, but these three in particular have knacks and are known for doing certain things. Let's take Dan Harmon, for example. When it comes to story structuring and character development, there's no one better than Dan Harmon. He's the co-creator of Rick and Morty and the creator of Community. He's a genius when it comes to structuring stories. He is just fantastic at it. And if we look at someone like Rob Schrab, who has worked with Dan Harmon before, and if you ever listened to the podcast Harmontown when that was going on, you know that Rob Schrab was frequently on there with Dan Harmon. He is incredibly talented at creating these weird kind of bizarro worlds, but also making them feel really genuine. It's almost hard to describe, but if we look at one of Rob Schrab's most famous works, Scud the Disposable Assassin, you can see this wildly creative and bizarre world be brought to life in a really strange manner, but also real manner at the same time. It's very difficult to describe, but that's kind of what Rob Schrab brings to the table, an indescribable quality of just creativity. And if Dan Harmon and Rob Schrab being on the same team wasn't good enough, they also added in Pamela Petler, who worked writing for the movie 9, a personal favorite of mine. Now, story-wise, I will say 9 has some issues, but when it comes to atmosphere in writing, it's perfect. It knows exactly when to have its characters speak. It knows when its characters speaking would be useless and would just take away from what the movie is truly trying to show. It seems like Pamela Petler, although I'm not fully aware of her work like I am with Rob Schrab and Dan Harmon, she is a master at showing and not telling. These three coming together is a recipe for success, and it shows in Monster House with its flawless story throughout the film. But putting the story aside for 1 minute, it's time for us to talk about the atmosphere of Monster House and the overall feeling that the audience is supposed to have while watching it. And obviously, it's a horror movie with kids in it, set a good deal in the past. It's obvious some things come with that territory. It wants you to feel scared, it wants you to feel nostalgic. Think kind of like Stranger Things, except not so heavy-handed with the nostalgia. And that's not a jab at Stranger Things or anything. I do really enjoy that show. It's just sometimes with Stranger Things, it can feel really heavy-handed with that nostalgia and just kind of obvious and hitting you over the head with it. Monster House never feels like that. I didn't grow up in the 80s. I have very little nostalgia for it, yet somehow this movie, watching it as a 20-year-old, made me feel nostalgic for just when I was a kid. That's the perfect capturing of nostalgia in my mind, because it's not specific. It's very much general, and it can kind of apply to anyone that had a childhood, where if you went trick-or-treating or celebrated Halloween, you could kind of get behind this movie and the feeling it was offering. And when it came to scary stuff, that's a lot easier, because you don't have to be specific to things, you just have to be atmospheric. You have to make it feel scary and creepy, which of course is easier said than done, which is why so many horror movies fail. But somehow Monster House doesn't have to rely on jump scares or these cheap thrills in order to make its movie scary. It's again a feat in writing, a bit of a feat in animation and presentation of the Monster House just in general. Its design is fantastic across the board. I love it. And that's in a movie where the animation is a little bit iffy for me, but again, we'll get to that in a little bit. This movie nails it, and I don't think there's a single instance where I would say, oh, that's a jump scare, for sure. There's a kind of cheap scare or cheap quality to this movie. It never feels like that. All of its scares, every time it gave me chills, or every time I was like, wow, that's actually really scary. That's a interesting way of presenting that scary thing. Every time that happened, it was 100% genuine, and that is, again, even more praise for this film. But you know what? We'll put atmosphere aside, we'll put the story aside, all that stuff I think is fantastic. But like I said, we have to talk about the animation, which is easily the biggest gripe I have with this movie, and I'm sure it's the biggest gripe many people have with this movie, because Monster House came out at a terrible, terrible time. A time I like to call the motion capture fad era. I mentioned in the introduction of this film how terrifying it was that the Adam Sandler film Click was nominated for an Oscar, but that being somewhat of a joke, there is one thing that was going on in 2006 that was seemingly genuinely terrifying to a lot of people in Hollywood and a lot of audiences. The prospect of motion capture being the future of Hollywood. Not just the future of animation, but the future of filmmaking in general, to the point where people thought that only the best of the best will be used in motion cap and be used in every single film ever created, and the rest would be outcast. They thought it would be the end of the industry. What a stupid thing to think. Now, don't get me wrong, motion capture absolutely has its merits, and the technology has come a very long way since this movie's release in 2006. However, this movie in 2006, when it comes to motion capture, had a slew of issues with just getting movement from actual humans to look human. It looks really stiff and stagnant in a lot of the wide shots for Monster House. It looks bizarre, and it takes a whole lot of getting used to. Looking back on this, sure, it's revolutionary, but I cannot imagine people actually being worried that this was gonna be the future. It's absolutely ridiculous to me, and honestly, this movie, Monster House, would have benefited from traditional animation or traditional 3D animation. I think motion capture is the only real thing that holds this movie back. In terms of art style, it's pretty dang good. It's unique for sure. It's a little bit stiff in some areas. They kind of look like wooden dolls, but frankly, you don't have many movies that look like this, and that's fine, I think, if you can go in that unique style. And this unique style brought us the Monster House itself, which is genuinely scary in terms of design. However, it's right as the human beings start moving where this movie becomes really uncanny. Everyone's so stiff, it's like their joints don't work correctly, and the fact that motion capture at this time was being talked about as real human movement brought to life on the big screen through animation, it just becomes hilarious when you look back at it, because it's like, oh yeah, humans absolutely move like this. See what I mean? See how he goes? Look at him go. That's how humans move. It's goofy as hell today, sure, but back then, I mean, we have to understand, this was groundbreaking, for sure, but I think it hurt the timelessness of this movie that otherwise has everything going for it. It really makes it a little bit more difficult to watch more genuinely without having some ironic laughs at it, because really this movie is so strong, it's just held back by the actual visuals on screen, at least in most cases. Like I've said multiple times in this video, I think the design of the house and just the concept of how that works is fantastic. I think it would have benefited from different animation, but they still were able to pull it off with the crazy motion cap style. And obviously, I don't think they got an actual house to motion cap for the house, and that's probably why it looks so good, and that probably proves my point right there. Motion capture at this time harmed good movies, or at least harmed one really good movie, because I don't think anyone's going to argue that Mars Needs Mom would have been much better with a different animation style. I think that one was doomed from the start. But I guess we can move away from motion capture real quick and just talk about the voice acting and those performances, because across the board, they're all really, really solid. From the kids voice acting in it, to Steve Buscemi, to even John Heder, I think everyone that was in this movie brought something to it and did a fantastic job. I have no gripes with that whatsoever. And with that being said, I think we've gotten through all of my talking points for Monster House and we're ready for a conclusion. I have no nostalgia for Monster House. Like I said, I'm reviewing this movie, I'm doing a retrospective on it completely as an adult watching this movie that was made for kids back in 2006. I had no thoughts about it in my head until I decided to watch it, other than some assumptions I made from the trailers that I saw when I was a kid. And so everything I'm saying to you is from the perspective of an adult. That being said, I think everyone should watch this movie. If you haven't seen it yet, if you have seen it but you're not going back for some reason, it's fantastic. It's just as good as you remember, as maybe not in the animation department, but in terms of story, in terms of characters, in terms of just Halloween fun, Monster House absolutely nails it. I adore this movie. And if you're not giving it a try because you think the motion cap is too uncanny, I will say you get used to it. It's jarring at first, for sure, and there's some really obvious bits where you're like, whoa, that's pretty goofy looking, but you get used to it as kind of an art style after a little while, which I think if you're just giving this a skip because of the motion capture, you are, in a whole, missing out on something really fantastic. That's perfect and just in time for Halloween. So go check out Monster House. If I had to give this one a score out of 10, I've thought about it a lot because it's a movie that I think presentation-wise in every area but the actual visuals is perfect. I think I'm safe giving this movie a 9 out of 10. I'm alright with that, despite taking off a point for that really jarring, horrible motion capture. Maybe I should take off a bit more for it. I don't know, maybe an 8 out of 10, but right now I'm sitting at a 9. Let me know down in the comment section below what you think of Monster House, what you think of the motion capture, the writing, the story, everything about it. I want to hear about it, and hopefully you'll check it out this Halloween. And stay tuned here on Mr. Cal for some more Halloween videos, as well as some of the older ones from last year where I talked about Over the Garden Wall and regular shows Terror Tales of the Park, as well as Hoobie Halloween. I'll have some of those linked at the end of this video, and stay tuned for more. There's always more spooky, scary stuff, some more Christmas stuff coming around the corner, and always more stuff from me, Mr. Cow. And I will see you all next time. Goodbye.